Uhuru. I am Solyana, your very own managing editor for the longest running Black Power journal, the Burning Spear newspaper.
Uhuru comrades, I'm Dr. Mariah, promotions manager and volunteer at Black Power 96 Radio, bringing you the voice of our community to this panel.
You are now tuned into the season 1 finale of One Africa Worldview, the weekly news podcast bringing you revolutionary analysis on the day's top headlines. This show is a program of Burning Spear Media and is aired on the Burning Spear TV YouTube channel and Burning Spear Media on Rumble. We sum everything up from the African Internationalist perspective, a theory developed by Chairman Omali, leader of the Uhuru movement, which centers the issue of colonialism and the colonial mode of production as the leading cause of war, poverty, genocide, oppression, and exploitation we experience throughout the world. Hate the censorship of authentic revolutionary voices? Well, you could take this moment to like and subscribe and help us reach our 15,000 subscriber goal by the end of this month. We will actually kick off today's show with the Whirlwind Weekly Update, followed by our primary objective, and then we'll end with For the Culture segment, where we deliver briefs on the most important issues going on in our communities worldwide. So with that, we can move on to our next segment with our very first headline. So even though the US and Trump has declared that Iran and Israel have a ceasefire and claimed it was a mutual agreement, Iran has made it clear that Israel asked for the ceasefire and that it's not only a cessation, and it's only a cessation of hostilities. If, or rather, when Israel attacks Iran again, Iran will respond forcefully. Iran was the clear victor in this first battle. And furthermore, CNN had to admit that US bombs were unable to destroy Iran's nuclear capability. This week, Iran arrested 7 Mossad-affiliated agents, 19 Indian collaborators with Israeli intelligence, and has expelled 2 Indian diplomats. Iran has immense popular support among Iranians and from millions around the world. And, Iran refraining from damaging Israel at the moment is understood as a strategy in the wider war against Israel. Iran now knows what it is to fight Israel militarily and has a greater understanding of Israel's attack patterns as well as its own weaknesses. Iran's Guardian Council and government has ended cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency, expelled all IAEA agents, and removed all of the cameras of this agency. Residents of Cyprus are now complaining that Israelis are illegally mass buying land in Cyprus, establishing Israeli-only gated communities and occupying their country. That's not necessarily new now, is it? And reportedly, 600,000 Israelis are in Cyprus. Iran denied IAEA Director Rafael Grossi access to Iran's nuclear facilities. And, Iran plans to investigate whether Israel used Azerbaijan as a launch pad for drones into Iran. Iranian missiles are quiet for now, but the cost to Israel is $1 billion a day, as in billion with a B, for military costs, property damage, compensation claims for 300,000 reservists and 15,000 displaced Israelis. In just 20 months, Israel's war against Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran cost over $725 million. There are now disputes over budget increases in the Israeli government, and they did not account for damage from Iran in their budget. And reports say that the US has used 15 to 20% of its THAAD missile interceptors, which cost over $800 million. Ireland is the first European country to stop trade and imports from Israeli settlements. And if you know anything about the Irish, that's not necessarily new either. And crucially, the Palestinian resistance has strengthened in Khan Yunis, forcing several Israeli brigades to withdraw. This is a really rapidly developing story, as everyone knows. So we will keep you updated regarding these developments in the Burning Spear newspaper, as well as on our Burning Spear Substack as well.
Wow, it's just so much changing, so much with that. And like you said, that is somewhere to keep up with is at the Burning Spear. And just talking about that, now we'll take a look at protesters that were killed, at least 400 others that were wounded on Wednesday when anti-government protests at the capital, Nairobi, turned deadly. And Kenyan officials have not disclosed the number of casualties, actually. And, this is just a tip of it as far as these numbers that we're looking at. And reports from the media and rights groups varied and coming in, placing that number of dead between 8 and 16, and most were actually killed by the police. And as reported by Al Jazeera, this is the latest outbreak of violence in the East African country, where young demonstrators have frequently taken to the streets in recent months to protest the myriad issues, including police brutality, government corruption, and even high taxes. And the demonstrations on Wednesday were held to mark the bloody June 25th, 2024 protest against tax rises. The tax rises when police opened up fire on large numbers of protesters, and that at that time killing at least 60. And that was according to the rights groups in the area. Just bearing those Kenyan flags, the protesters chanted slogans like "Ruto must go" and "Occupy State House" in opposition to President William Ruto's government and referring to his official residence. Banks and schools in Nairobi's central business district were shut in anticipation of these protests, and police had cordoned off the State House as well as the Parliament building with layers of barbed wire. Last year, protesters broke into the Parliament block, chasing out politicians and setting parts of the building actually on fire. Wednesday's march was largely peaceful at first, and then much smaller compared with last year's protests. And scenes in Nairobi, however, turned violent later on after goons, or men believed to be undercover security officials and armed with whips and clubs, attacked these protesters. Police also used live fire, rubber bullets, and water cannons, tear gas. Just all of that was dispersed on these demonstrators. And we'll play a short video here from Al Jazeera taking a look at the demonstrations and comments from those protesters that were actually on the ground.
This went on all day. Protesters who came here to the Kenyan capital say they want to pay tribute to the more than 60 people who were killed during anti-government protests last year. Some are still missing. They blame the police.
They are involved in extrajudicial killings. They are involved in enforced disappearances, and they are involved in, kidnapping people.
Selivina Mwihaki came early morning. She says she wants her voice heard.
Every drop that is dropping like this, the whole nation, the whole continent, we are rising because we have said as the Republic of Kenya, we are done shedding blood because of power.
This protester says he wants better from the leaders.
The government is taking us as a joke. They don't want to listen to us. They want to go on to their family alone. They have to listen to us as the citizens. We are the people, and the sovereignty because of the power of the people.
Beyond Nairobi, there was similar demonstrations held in other parts of the country. Everyone saying the same thing. They want an end to police brutality. They want justice.
There's a lot of anger on the streets, and sometimes it gets dangerous. Those young men are using stones. The police try to disperse them. But a lot of people that we've talked to say that they are very angry at the police. They say that the police have been using too much force, and they say they will not be intimidated because of all this.
These protests have been heightened even more by the killing of a blogger and teacher who was tortured in a police station. He was arrested after he accused the Deputy Inspector General of Police of corruption. He has since stepped aside from his role, and other police officers who were at the station at the time have been charged with murder. But many Kenyans want more done.
So we are here to demand justice. Justice in terms of compensation, justice in terms of arrest of those officers who are involved, justice in terms of police reforms, because too many Kenyans are losing their lives in the hands of the police.
Most of the people we talk to say they are frustrated and disillusioned, and those in power are not listening to them. Catherine Soy, Al Jazeera, Nairobi.
Uhuru, thank you so much for that headline, Comrade Mariah. I just want to say that it's so empowering to see these Africans rise up in the way that they are. There's this really immense level of fearlessness that these Africans in Kenya are, exhibiting by, just coming out like that and resisting this neo-colonial government in Kenya in the form of, Ruto, and And, the woman that they showed specifically talking about, how Kenya is rising up, how the continent is rising up. And this is, an expression of it in East Africa, but you also see it with the alliance of the Sahel states and in the Sahel. And it's just a really powerful moment in, what's taking place in the African continent right now. And it's, we should look at this and see it as an attack on the colonial system, because that's what this is, right? This is the expression of the people coming out in this way. And so I just wanted to mention that. And also, speaking of other news in the African world, it has been a full year since the deployment of an international police force had stepped on Haiti's shores with the intent to pull, quote, Haiti out of the clutches of gang chaos. This military force was supplied mostly by the Kenyan government to address what has been called a bleak situation in Port-au-Prince, which is Haiti's capital. This is where it is reported that gangs have taken control and are launching an expansion to other parts of the country and just have control over the resources and businesses over the areas that they are in control of. And this, coupled with, the history of neo-colonial and imperial terror that has been inflicted on Haiti by both the U.S. government and the, original colonizers, the French, has been the situation that Africans in Haiti have been trying to escape by, migrating to other countries. And, the United States is one of those places. But despite the fact that, the U.S.'s imperial designs in Haiti that have worsened, if not caused, the miserated conditions that African people in Haiti are trying to escape, as we see, the U.S. government has launched yet another attack on African migrants from Haiti living in the U.S. by revoking the legal status and the work permits of hundreds of thousands of them. And this is because, as the government sees it, and this is a direct quote from, I think, the head of ICE or DHS, I think, the Department of Homeland Security, they say the environmental situation in Haiti has improved enough that it is safe for Haitian citizens to return home, unquote. And so this isn't, a new thing. Lest we forget, back in 2021, we saw photos of Border Patrol on horseback looking like slave overseers, because that's what they are, chasing down Haitian migrants along the Rio Grande as they were trying to return to a camp near the border. And if this isn't bad enough, we're also hearing talks of Eric Prince, who's the former CEO and co-founder of Blackwater, which is a private military contracting company, basically mercenaries, this institution that is guns for hire, right? So you're paying people to go into countries and destabilize. They played a big role in what they call the global war on terror as well. And they're supposedly getting hired by the Haitian government to, quote, conduct lethal operations against armed forces in Port-au-Prince. But therein also lies the agenda to, further displace Africans in the bid to, expropriate the land, right? So they're not just attacking these gangs that they say are threatening, but they are trying to displace Africans in Haiti as well. And Blackwater, by the way, is the same group that had killed 17 civilians back in 2007 in Iraq, among other atrocities that they are responsible for. So what we're seeing with this attack on Haiti as a state and the attack on African people as a collective in Haiti is part of the, imperialist retaliation against Haiti for waging the first workers' revolution in the form of the Haitian Revolution in the beginning of the 19th century, right? This is the revolutionary legacy that states like the US and France have been trying to quell by basically punishing Haiti with economic programs that essentially had, Haiti pay a fee for daring to break the yoke of colonialism, right? Perry had to pay reparations to France. That's insane. So when we see these kinds of attacks, it's really important that we, put it into the context of colonialism, because all of these different forms of repression stem from and reinforce, the world economic system that we identify as the colonial mode of production, right? And this is a world socioeconomic system that functions by the exploited labor of colonized people. So when we see this, war come out like this, when we see the attacks on African migrants, it's all a part of this colonial system that has at its basis and as its logic the expropriation of land and labor, right? That's what keeps the sort of engine of colonialism running, and the engine of the economic system that we call capitalism, which stems from colonialism, keeps it going and keeps it reinforcing itself. And something we also wanted to mention about Kenya is that it's a neo-colonial government, right? Kenya was, as we know, colonized by the British, and the Mau Mau under Dedan Kimathi, led a really brave struggle against the British government. And what we're seeing in Haiti is also neo-colonialism. This is why we understand that uniting the African nation is a really critical question. And Africans in the U.S., Africans in Haiti, Kenya, Burkina Faso, really must unite to overturn the colonial mode of production, because we are one people, right? We are one African nation, and this colonial system, is born out of the attack on African people. Chairman has always said that, you don't, again, and I've said this before on the show, that, again, you don't get on the boat as an African, you don't come off the boat as anything else. Well, I'm kind of butchering what he's saying, but that's the logic behind what he's saying there, right? So we understand that we are one African people. All of these attacks that we're seeing is an attack. An attack on Haiti is an attack on an African in St. Louis. It's an attack on an African in Alabama. It's an attack on African in Virginia. It's an attack on African in Burkina Faso. So we just wanted to mention that, and the concept of the African nation is really important to African internationalism. Comrade Mariah, did you want to add something?
I do. When it comes to this, what we're really witnessing over in Haiti, even Kenya, is just that really brutal example of that neo-colonialism. It's an action to where the foreign powers, that they continue to dominate the people, exploit our African people, and it's through these puppet regimes and the military, really, and that occupation in the areas. And what we're seeing now is our sisters and brothers, they're in that struggle. Haiti's in struggle, Kenya too. But what we're seeing is that they're uniting, as you mentioned, of the African nation. And I mean, just across the borders, languages and territories. It's not just important, it's really essential right now. And I want to say that super essential to crush that colonial mode of production that we keep talking about and build a single liberated African economy. And that's something that will only happen by African people leading that, and African working class. And that's, we always say, one Africa, one nation.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And just to sort of define too what neocolonialism is, because we mentioned it, and we kind of assume that people understand. But neocolonialism also is, in essence, white power and blackface, right? So I think a good way to understand it too is after a lot of African countries gained their independence, there was this idea that, okay, now we have a first Black president, we have all these Black governments that are supposed to really lead the liberation of Africans, really become this embodiment of what a free Africa will look like post-colonialism. Obviously, we know that has totally failed, because the logic of colonialism continued through neocolonialism, through the fact that all of these presidents and prime ministers that were in power, even if they might have sounded revolutionary in the beginning, what we see through them is the power of Europe working through them. If Africa was truly liberated from Europe in a really profound way, in a really materialistic way, in a political and economic way. And we understand that the political and economic are one, right? You cannot have political freedom without economic freedom, and vice versa. If that's the case, you could look at any sort of economic data that's out there now, will show you, okay, what kind of things are, African states producing, and what are they exporting, right? And then what are the things that Europe is producing and exporting? And every single time you see that data, going back to when they began collecting this data, right, but maybe around the 60s, is that Africans to this day are still producing raw materials, or the things that don't require what they will say skilled labor. So it's not turned into finished goods. So for example, I always use Ethiopia as an example, but Ethiopia, for example, I think about 40 to 50% of the exports that we still do is coffee, and then other crops, right? You could look at places like Namibia. Namibia still exports, I believe, either gold or diamond, and these are, again, from the mines. And then we have the Congo too, who exports a lot of coltan. And then when you go up to Nigeria, it's all oil. I mean, Nigeria is actually I think in the 90% crude oil. right?
Wow.
Like it's a all of it is just oil economy. So what that does is it's reinforcing the colonial economy that was established under, you know, when colonial attack happened, is that, you know, you're locking African people into exporting these raw materials. Europe is setting the prices on those raw materials and setting the prices of the labor that is used to process those raw materials. So at every level, Africans are not involved, and Africans are alienated from the labor that they're producing. That turns into billions when it reaches Europe.
Billions. Yeah.
When we talk about Belgian chocolate, I mean, that's Congo. There's no such thing as no damn Belgian chocolate. Like, what is that, right? So you see all of these things. It robs African people from the resources that they have, and so this colonial system again locks this African people into this exploitative relationship for which we have no way out, and except for revolution, right? And you know, I just think that's really important to mention. And you know, throughout history, we see people like, you know, Kwame Nkrumah and even Nasser, who, you know, wanted to nationalize all of these things, all of these resources that African people had access to in the land, because the land is rich. We say Africa is not poor; it is being exploited because of this very reason. And so, if African people had control over this, they will, you know, African people would be able to have that power to again contend with Europe in a really meaningful way. And what I really appreciate about the parties too, because we're doing this on a sort of microcosmic level, right? We have these economic programs, independent economic programs that fuels the work that the African People's Socialist Party does, because we understand, you know, economic freedom is inherently connected to political freedom. And, you know, if we have the ability to feed, clothe, and house ourselves, that will mean a lot. And and then we have a comment here: workers' revolution, dear, it was a slave revolt. Slaves and workers are two different things. Mute. Okay, so that is a comment from YouTube, from Bonaha Guziki 307. Okay, you know, I appreciate the comment. But I do want to say that you know, African people who were enslaved in Haiti were definitely you know, enslaved, but they were also, you know, it was their labor that was being exploited, right? And so the fact that the Haitian Revolution is a workers' revolution, far from what we see in places like the French Revolution or even the American Revolution, that was very much so a bourgeois revolution led by sort of intellectuals. The Haitian Revolution was inspired by enslaved people who realized that by stopping, you know, this relationship they have with their enslavers, by refusing to work and then exterminating the you know, the people who have put them in this position as enslaved people, that is a workers' revolution, right? It's addressing the very nature of their relationship to their enslavers, right? It's African labor that was being exploited in that process, and it was African labor that was you know, attempting to be liberated in that process as well. And so we do understand it as a workers' revolution, because it wasn't a top-down revolution, it was a bottom-up revolution. So I just wanted to mention that as well. But I hope that made sense. Comrade Mariah, did you want to add anything to that?
I do, just in a response to that, just going back to that same thing of that neo-colonial control, really, it's just that, and we don't want to undermine any of that, but when it comes to that, it's military force, but then it comes into that capitalistic power. And when it comes to that, that's what they use to keep that control, fuel that conflict, and just really protect their own interests. And that own interest does not include African lives.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And we also have a comment for Comrade, I believe that's Comrade Jainabah, one of our beautiful co-host that's unfortunately not here with us today. She says it's absolutely insane that IET had to pay France a single effing franc. Down with colonialism, up with African internationalism. Salute Chairman Omali Shatella and DC Ona Yeshatella. Uhuru. That's, yeah, unite with that. And yeah, and that's also again the logic of colonialism, right? Even when African people in Haiti were able to lead this really amazing revolution that just meant so much to African people too, because when, you know, this revolution happened, it was also, and the first Black state was basically established after this revolution. There was a call that said, all enslaved people come to Haiti and now you are free, right? So even back then in the 1800s, in the very early 1800s, the consciousness of an African nation was there, right? They understood what it meant to have this collective collective state led by Black people. And they understood that if you got on the boat as an African, you're getting off the boat as an African, right? Because they made this call for any Black person who had this relationship to was enslaved by the system. And so I think that's really important to mention too. And then we also have another comment: the enslaved were unpaid laborers, i.e. workers, who were exactly my that was the point I was long-windedly trying to make earlier. But I'm really appreciating all the comments that are coming up. I believe we have a few more minutes before we actually head to our next segment. We have another question. Mariah, do you want to go ahead and take that one?
Yeah. Why didn't Africa have the will till the Portuguese came into sub-Saharan Africa?
Why didn't Africa? I don't think that's historically accurate. Is that why didn't Africa have the will till the Portuguese came into sub-Saharan Africa? Yeah, I don't, I think this kind of question comes from this, understanding of history as, civilization as we understand it today was something that was exported to Africa, or imported to Africa, or it's the classic sort of, African inferiority sort of thing, right? And so it comes from this this rejection really of the real genius that African people have contributed to world knowledge in a really profound way. And there's a lot of evidence really, if you can look at some of the works that archaeologists do, but a lot of civilizations, not just Egypt, a lot of attention goes to Egypt too, but a lot of the genius that came out of Africa, you can see Africans have this relationship with Greek civilizations, right? Have this intellectual relationship. There was so much of an intellectual culture that was expressed through the Arabic language in Africa as well. And there's actually, this reminds me, a book by Ivan van Sertima talking about They Came Before Columbus. Now, this book has been used to kind of feed into this narrative about foundational Black Americans or ADOS and stuff like that. But that book, I think, also is an example of, I'm taking it as an example of the technological lengths that African people have reached, because in that book, Ivan van Sertima goes through how West African civilizations were able to cross the Atlantic way before Columbus ever did that in 1492, right? We all learned that how does it go? Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Well, yeah, sure he did, but so did way more people before him, right? So that also is an example of just the technological advancement that African people have done. And so, when we look at questions like that, it's important to kind of put it into the context of what kind of assumptions are we making about history and how are we reading history in that way, right? So.
When it comes to that, we don't want to be stagnant. When it comes to we want to be aware and to acknowledge that question. That's a good question. But when it comes to Africa and the knowledge there, Africa didn't really, we had the knowledge of the will. It didn't, what it took was being able to adapt to what was needed, adapt to what was being innovated during the time. And when it comes to that, let's just be real. Africa we made the will. We gave you the will.
Exactly. And there's a comment from Hobby Bobby. Miseducation is a huge consequence of colonialism. Nothing new. Salute to our host for speaking the real history. Oh, that's absolutely right. And, miseducation is definitely something that we see a lot. And it's definitely an expression of the sort of the ideological imperialism, right? Colonialism happened. How do we reinforce these ideas of African inferiority and How do we cull any revolutionary sort of fervor that will necessarily be inspired by not only knowing your history, but using it as a source of power too, right? We look to the Haitian Revolution all the time in the party. We look to the Universal Negro Improvement Association. We pull all of these historical moments in African history that are not just symbols of resistance, but inform the kind of work that we do today, because they were fighting the same thing that we were fighting. We need not reinvent the wheel, because, you know, again, this work that we are continuing, we say, you know, liberation in our lifetime, but it is not a work that we invented. It is the work that we're inheriting. We're trying to complete the Black Revolution of the 60s, right? And so that necessarily requires an accurate understanding of history. And with that comes identifying the kind of role that the colonial educational system sort of plays, and not just the educational system too, but like media as well, right? I mean, the whole reason why we have a show like this is to try to poke holes in a lot of things that's still said about Africans today. And still, especially when we're talking about news, and it's actually kind of related to our primary objective this week, but how does education in the media position African people and portray African people in a, not just in a harmful way, but again, in a way that attacks the way that we see ourselves and the way that we see other Africans throughout the world. And, you know, what does that do for us? And I think, you know, that's really harmful, and institutions like the Burning Spear are really important in sort of combating that. But before I do segue us to our main story for today, Comrade Mariah, is there anything else that you wanted to add?
No, just like really want to go back to that whole thing of how you said the educating ourselves and doing it for ourselves, as far as we want to go back to that will and keep saying, when it comes to that, we've made the will. We've been riding that will. We gave you the will, and we built everything that you have is because of our will. So, hey, I just want to make sure that that's made, that point's made, and that point's aware.
I appreciate that. Thank you. All right, comrades. Well, thank you for those comments. Even some of the trolls, you know, we had to address this. But so moving on to our main story, comrades. When we're discussing the weekly news podcast, we're clear that, you know, we must analyze these issues from the perspective of the colonized African working class. If we are relying on the colonizer to inform us of the, you know, atrocities they commit, and to tell us where the real responsibility lies for the instability and violence against Africans from Haiti or the genocide of Palestinians, you know, we will never know the truth. And more than this, we'll be stuck with an explanation that, again, justifies our oppression and exploitation, right? So our primary objective this week re-explores the question, does the media tell the truth? A question answered by Chairman Omali in a presentation he made in 1985 in Berkeley, California. First, it's important to mention that U.S. residents' trust in colonial mainstream media is at an all-time low, and it continues to plummet according to a Gallup survey that was published in October 2024. So just 31% of people in the U.S. said they trust the media, and most of that trust comes from individuals aged 65 years or older, and 36% no confidence, and the remaining report have very little trust. And so this has contributed to masses of people turning to independent news sources and social media outlets to gather information and garner perspective. And despite the turn away from traditional media entities like the New York Times and CNN, Washington Post, and others, this doesn't mean that we are suddenly, you know, getting more truthful or accurate news. It also doesn't take away from, you know, whatever class interests that independent journalists and social media commentators serve. So this is why the, you know, intervention of the African People's Socialist Party has really been critical, namely through our very own the Burning Spear newspaper and our, you know, expanding platforms that provides African internationalism on just every question.
Every questionnaire. And just looking at what Chairman Omali's presentation in 1985, he actually makes the point that all media serves a particular class interest. And despite the idea that media is supposed to be unbiased or even objective, furthermore, he actually clarifies that the media is a function of the state. And this is why every time an African is murdered by the police in this country, we hear more about the victim's background, their childhood, parents, the communities, all that's to blame, and to justify the deaths that they give and the deaths that they impose on us. And why it's well documented how the media instigated attacks against the African community, resulting in stuff like lynchings, mass murder, and destruction by those white mobs. And it's over and over again. It's why we hear sometimes these backward ideas about immigrants coming to rape the white women or assault law enforcement, all that, leading to people supporting ICE raids and immigration crackdowns. And we're seeing that happening right now. And when an African is murdered by the colonial state, the ones rushing to the murder scene side by side to corroborate the pig's lies is actually the media. And when the FBI attacked this movement in 2022, the mainstream media didn't even attempt to investigate and come to their own conclusions. They just printed off the words of the Department of Justice as if it were true, and they were working to sway public opinion in favor of the U.S. government. The U.S. government often criticized and attempts to make the colonizer population afraid of this concept of state-controlled media. But Chairman Omali exposed that, and it's been state control. It's been state control all along, serving the interests of colonial ruling class only.
Exactly. And, again, Chairman raised this question, does the media tell the truth? Which truth? And that in and of itself is such a revealing question, right? He also said, and I'm quoting, "We must first recognize that we are talking about class differences. It is in the interest and it is the social responsibility of the slumlord to get as much as he can for the joint that the people are living in, while doing as little as necessary for the place. It is the social responsibility of the tenant to pay as little for the joint that he's living in, while getting his landlord to do as much as he can for the joint. That's the social responsibility. There are different social responsibilities. It is the social responsibility of the undertaker to get as many dead bodies as he can in East Oakland. He likes the fact that Black people live 7 years less than white people. I don't care what color he is, because the fact of the matter is that his reality is tied to Black people dying. It is my responsibility to live as long as I can." Someone wants to tell me that we have a common social responsibility. They would have me believe that because a slumlord is a nice person, because he loves his mother and perhaps even got married in a situation where his wife wore white, that I should give him all my money. They would have me believe that because the undertaker makes good speeches, I should accommodate him by dying early. We say no. There are different objective material interests at play, unquote. So it's clear that, the colonial ruling class's interest is to keep African and colonized people oppressed. It's to keep the colonizer ignorant, mindlessly supporting, the ruling class as they edge them onto the brink of nuclear war, right? And this is achieved by continuing to perpetuate the ideas of the colonial mode of production, which the media serves to do. Why else would the bourgeois media be, lying about Ukraine and Russia or Iran, Israel, and Palestine, right? It's because there's a class interest there. And, whereas our media has a social responsibility to serve the oppressed and exploited African working class, right? We are to function as part of the incipient African socialist government, propagating the ideas of African internationalism.
Our media actually tells the truth. And the truth of the African working class, of the oppressed around the world suffering under that same parasitic social system known as that colonial mode of production. And unlike many of the newer and independent news entities out there, as Chairman says, we don't consider ourselves alternative media. We consider ourselves a contending force. This is why it was crucial for the Chairman to be found the burning spear, and for us to build upon this foundation with books, pamphlets, flyers, posters, radio, and our increasing social media presence, which includes the One Africa Worldview podcast.
Right. And, the New York Times might not be, transparent about their goals and objective as a media entity, but, stated expertly by our dear comrade, Omawale Kefing, who loved and worked for the Spear before his passing. He said in an article, one sure way to gauge or judge an organization's commitment to the revolutionary project is its documentation of what it wants, what it believes, its political work, and its position on major and minor political and military events in the world. In other words, its commitment to a political journal or newspaper, unquote. So Chairman Omali closed this presentation by saying, "We are contending forces. right? We have enough faith in ourselves and the history of an informed people to believe that we will win. As they say in places that that the Oakland Tribute does not like to write about favorably, Magbar imperialism. In Farsi, spoken in Iran, this means death to imperialism. So yeah, I just want to open it up just for 5 minutes before we head into our next section. What do we think? Are we surprised that people are turning away from mainstream media? Is this overdue? Comrade Mariah, I'll give you the floor if you have any comments.
Absolutely. I mean, it's actually crystal clear. It's crystal clear that when it comes to this colonial ruling class, I mean, they have a vetted interest, and they have an interest in maintaining the oppression of African and colonized people. And it's not just through the exploitation that we talk about, but it's also about keeping the colonizer population ignorant and complicit. And when they're ignorant and complicit, that's where they want you to be. And they use media as that weapon to uphold that. And when it comes to that colonial mode of production, just feeding those lies, the distractions, all the stuff that we're exposing here, we talk about, I mean, just that fear to keep the masses aligned with what their agenda. And when it comes to that, they're just really, really pushing the world into the spot to where they want it. But no, right now, and as we keep exposing, it's a revolution. It's a revolutionary media like the Burning Spear media and Black Power 96 radio. And that's what it takes to be critical. And it's very critical to expose these lies, expose them, and raise the consciousness of what our African working class people. Uhuru.
Uhuru, I love how you put that, Comrade Mariah. That is our promotions manager for Black Power 96, so tap in. But yeah, we also have a comment from Unemployed Scholar 403020. One Africa Worldview is the best political podcast on this platform. Uhuru, well, I'm biased, but you know what? I'm afraid to say that I'm not biased, but I am biased. But yeah, I just, really appreciate you mentioning that, Comrade Mariah. And, historically speaking, African newspapers have been just really, really important to, covering, not just covering, but, or historically, they've really been important in covering the mainstream things that the mainstream news have never covered, especially when it comes to the kind of things that African people have been subjected to, right? The Tulsa Massacre is a really good example where, as things were happening, the white newspapers were not talking about it. White newspapers were not covering the extent of the damage, the kind of things that were happening. It was actually the Black Dispatch that, again, covered what happened, talked, just exposing the situation in Tulsa, right? And we have a comment that says mainstream media has been fake for too long. The internet has changed the game, and that's accurate too, right? The internet has, in a lot of ways, sort of democratized this space, so anyone with a mic can sort of hop on. But that and also has its issues, right? Because just because anyone on the mic can hop on and spread all of these things also doesn't necessarily mean a lot. But it is a sort of contending force, and how the what they call legacy media is sort of having to deal with that. And I think the One Africa Worldview is sort of in response to the fact that anyone with a mic can come on, right? But what we want to do is really, again, cover the kind of things that that mainstream media won't cover, but give it that African internationalist touch, right? We say we're not biased because we understand that, again, if news covers the if bourgeois media is a reflection of the class interest, the African people's newspaper, the Burning Spear newspaper, One Africa Worldview podcast, is biased towards the interests of the African working class, right? And so the kind of analysis that you see in our case, the African Internationalist analysis, puts world events into the context of, okay, what does this mean for African people? What does this mean for colonized people, right? What does Iran bombing Israel mean for the colonial system and other African people who are fighting the same fight, right? How do we connect the colonialism there to the colonialism here? And I think all of these things are, being accomplished really well through, through the news source that is the Burning Spear. And yeah, I am its managing editor, so I am biased, but hey man, again, we're not afraid to say we're biased. So with that, before we move on to our free or for the culture, Comrade Mariah, I'll give you the floor once more.
Yeah, Yeah, and just like going on back, when it comes to this media, we keep saying, we have to do it for ourselves. And as the U.S. government really continues this war on the colonial free speech and anti-colonial free speech, you can help us fight back by getting our channel to 15,000 subscribers. And this is the place that get your news and your analysis, because it's the sorely listed worldview of African workers and colonized people. And we are force-fed the perspective of the colonizer, in which is infused with their interests, their hopes, their aspirations, and as we keep saying, their fears. And we sometimes mistakenly adopt them as our own. And because we're not regularly having our own, seeing our own discussions, talking about our own things, and informed with our own struggle for our freedom, we get confused with that and we adopt that. So this is why you should support this by sharing, liking, and subscribing. Share, like, and subscribe. Continue on with our show. We head on to our final segment, For the Culture, kicked off with Comrade Solyana.
Uhuru, thank you so much. Yeah, so, for the culture this week, we wanted to raise up and talk a little bit about comrade, or he's not my comrade, I don't know him personally, but the African writer Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, who just passed recently. So 3 years before he, got to his 90th year, the world-renowned African writer Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o passed on Wednesday, May 28, and he was survived by his wife, his children, and his grandchildren, as well as, leaving behind this really giant legacy of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle on the cultural front of the African Revolution. And Ngũgĩ was born in 1938 in the town of Kamerutu, Kenya. And at this time, Kenya was still under the direct yoke of British colonialism. So he lived through some of the most, chaotic times in Kenya's history. And the kind of books that he wrote really reflect that. So some of his well-known works include A Grain of Wheat, which was set in 1963, a few days within Kenya's independence from Britain. And Weep Not Child, he wrote that while he was a student, actually, at Makerere University. And that deals with Africans and white settlers in rural Kenya during the Mama Rebellion. However, the work that, invited the most trouble for him, for which he was actually detained in December of 1977, was his play Ngahika Ndinda, which translates to I Will Marry When I Want. So this play was set in the Kenya shortly after independence, and it explores the legacies of colonialism and the difficulties that Africans in Kenya faced at the time by using themes of class struggle, poverty, gender, culture, religion, modernity versus tradition, and marriage and family. So it was actually performed at Kamerutu, his hometown, for 6 continuous weeks before it was shut down by the government. So it was a very popular play. And that's why the government stepped in, and it didn't like, I think, the fact that it was raising up all of these questions of, how colonialism was still sort of being propagated and, attacking the Kenyan government in a sort of implicit way. So he was detained for this play. And this was also around the time that Ngũgĩ led the effort to actually forego English literature in favor of literature in African languages, whether it be written or oral, at the University of Nairobi, right? And Ngũgĩ was actually probably best known for his philosophy on the role of language in the fight against cultural imperialism. That is the, destruction of African languages, the destruction of customs and traditions that colonialism brought with it. So sometime in the late 50s or mid to late 60s, I believe, he made the decision to completely abandon English and write his books in Gikuyu, his native African language. And as an African writer, he truly believed that his and the tasks of other African writers and the aim to resist this cultural imperialism was to engage with their African languages and develop them in the same way that Pushkin and Tolstoy did for Russian, or the way that, Shakespeare did for English. So this is what I mean when I say, he was waging the struggle against colonialism and imperialism on the cultural front. And this decision to abandon English did ruffle a lot of feathers. And it also inspired a lot of critiques, because some saw within it the supposition that Africans who either do choose to write in English as a preference, even if they can write in an African language, but they choose to write in English, as somehow un-African. That Ngũgĩ's philosophy, brings with it the argument that for it to be an African literature, it has to be in an African language. So you can see how that's very much limiting and sort of is a little bit determinist, right? That if you can't speak and if you can't write it in an African language, then is your literature an African literature, even if you're writing as an African, right? So him and Chinua Achebe, you know, also another writer, an African writer, definitely, you know, had their beef over these questions because Achebe was on the side of, you know, no, we need to use a colonizer's language, however much we hate it, because that's how we're gonna, you know, cut across the language difference among Africans. But then this goes back to Ngũgĩ's question of, well, how long can we do that before our own languages that colonialism destroyed, you know, are completely abandoned, right? And what does that even say to have this level of reliance on an on a language that is, you know, for Ngũgĩ, literally the language of our oppression, right? What does it mean to have a reliance on French? What does it mean to have a reliance on English in the way that we sort of communicate? And so this was one of the things that he was mostly known for, and he was impacted a lot by, you know, Fanon's philosophy on language too. And yeah, so again, he just recently passed, and just wanted to also mention that I did write a short article about his life, the kind of things that he did. Basically, the overview that I just gave now is pretty much the article that I wrote, but it will be featured in the July Spear. People are interested in just learning a bit more about him. But yeah, I just do want to, you know, open it up to Comrade Mariah to see if you had known about who he was, anything like that.
I have not, but just hearing this and just thinking of just going to some of the chairman's points, and I think of how the chairman mentioned the political and economic unity of African people will actually lead to a common African language, and I mean that's where we're seeing that. And when it comes to it, that's such a powerful point, because when it comes to fighting for our political and our economic unity, just really as African people, it really will take that rise to that same commonality to give that rise. And when it comes to that, it will be that common African language. And it won't really be anything that comes out of some form of like luxury or anything like that. It really will be really out of material and out of necessity. So when it comes to that, it will be something that our African controlled commerce and our self-determined drives, that's something that's pushing through that exchange, the exchange of our people. And when it comes to that language, it's really something that colonial capitalism, as we spoke about earlier, it's been something that they've used over and over and over to divide us, to really confuse us, to really just detach us and take us away from anything of our identity, anything of our power, and something of our African people. So just that development of that African language is just not about really speaking differently. It's about thinking differently. It's about really reorganizing those thoughts and just really learning to survive on our own terms, free from that colonial system and something that has robbed us for centuries now. You hear me?
No, that's really true, and I appreciate you bringing in, you know, Chairman's points too, because you know the development of African languages, you know, as noble of a goal it is, and that is something we should do. We should, you know, if you can write in an African language, go ahead and do that. You know, if you want to develop a particular literature culture within a culture that hasn't been able to because of colonialism, that's amazing, right? But the point is that, you know, the development of African languages is not necessarily like the goal unto itself, but it's part of this overall struggle against a colonial capitalist system that first and foremost robs us of the ability to survive on our own terms, right? And, you know, sort of connecting it back to the earlier point that we had, talking about, you know, economics, commerce, and politics, and how those are necessarily, you know, connected. The economic freedom of African people is what will necessitate this interconnection of Africans that will then lead to what Chairman has talked about in his essay, actually, African Identity is Key, which is featured in One Africa Worldview, a book that was published by the Burning Spear Media, will lead to this, you know, language, this unified language that commerce will inspire, right? When you have this interconnected continent that's not, you know, divided by these false borders. It's not divided by the fact that, you know, it's hard to get from, you know, from one country to another country in Africa. It's in a lot of ways easier to get to Europe than it is, you know, to get to places within Africa itself, right? So when these struggles are removed and when we have this interconnected economic relationship, a common language develops out of that. That's probably where we were headed anyway before colonialism interrupted that entire process. And so the question of languages is really important, but the question of reclaiming your language and saying that, you can't express an African thought without using an African language is I think, misguided at best. And I don't think that that's accurate, and it discounts a lot of revolutionary thought that has been expressed, regardless of the language that is used, despite the language that is used more saliently. But yeah, so before we head to the wrap up with, Comrade Dr. Mariah, I want to salute all those that make this show possible. Of course, our fabulous hosts. We have Dr. Mariah here with us today, but we have Director Akile as well, and Comrade Jainabah. We have our prep team and engineers, our headline writers over with the Burning Spear Media News Department, our video editors, post-production crew, and all this, without all of you, this show is impossible. So we wanted to raise those comrades up, and we also appreciate all of our viewers who were here with us today for your comments and your questions, and just thank you for taking a moment to like, subscribe, and get us closer to our 15,000 subscriber goal. So with that, I want to go back to you, Dr. Mariah.
All right. Now, solidarity with the North Side benefit for the Black Power Blueprint on Wednesday, July 9th at Work and Leisure. Join us for an evening of music, poetry, dance, food, and raffle prizes. All proceeds will go towards the Black Power Blueprint, Black community programs of self-determination and economic development in North St. Louis, rebuilding in the aftermath of the tornado devastation. Register and purchase your raffle tickets at blackpowerblueprint.org/benefit. That's blackpowerblueprint.org/benefit. There's a $25 registration, and there will also be a raffle with special prizes from local St. Louis artists and businesses. One Africa, One Nation Farmers Market, community, culture, and commerce in action. The One Africa, One Nation Farmers Market is more than a market. It's a hub for Black-owned businesses, grassroots organizing, and African self-determination. Don't miss your chance to be a part of this vibrant movement. This event, put on by NWU, will be taking place on Saturday, July 26, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. at the O'Fallon Park, located at 4343 West Florissant Avenue, St. Louis, Missouri, 63107. You can get more info at oneafricamarket.org. That's oneafricamarket.org. In 3 years since the FBI raids on the Uhuru movement, when we fight, we win. On Saturday, July 26, 2025, the Hands Off Uhuru Fight Back Coalition presents When We Fight, We Win, 3 years after the FBI raids on the Uhuru movement. Join us on the 3rd anniversary of the brutal FBI police raids on 7 homes and offices of the Uhuru movement in 2 cities as we hear messages of support and solidarity from numerous organizations and individuals who have stood with Chairman Omali and the Uhuru movement. Join the fight back to fund the legal defense to appeal the bogus conspiracy conviction. You can register at handsoffyahuru.org/Uhuru3. That's handsoffyahuru.org/Uhuru3. We are not retreating, we are building. Chairman Omali Yeshitela. And for more information, go to handsoffyahuru.org, handsoffyahuru.org. And that's it for what's upcoming this week. Don't forget to visit burningspear.com/events calendar to see and keep up with everything that's happening, and also to join us for the next season of One World Africa podcast.
Uhuru, thank you so much, Dr. Mariah, for those announcements, and thank you all for tuning in. Again, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and you can join us again on One Africa Worldview for Season 2, premiering July 21 at 5 p.m. Eastern on the Burning Spear TV YouTube and the Burning Spear Media Rumble channels. So with that, comrade, One Africa, One Nation.
One Nation.
Uhuru.